And in your new quarterly essay, Us and Them, on the importance of animals, you have a quote by John Coetzee in which he says, "Something's gone badly wrong in relations between human beings and other animals." There was a lot of outrage recently when Four Corners and Lateline showed footage of some horrific cases of animal cruelty in Indonesian abattoirs. I think you were already writing the essay at this time, but how did that affect what you wrote?
I mean, it would be impossible not to react. It would, even Indonesians I met who did watch it were horrified by it. And, you know, there were so many comment pieces and opinion pieces and editorials, and everyone was sort of weighing into the debate, and people were saying that if we stop sending our cattle over there, then people were going to starve, and if you're up for a cattle ban, therefore you're anti-human. And it seems like a really an obvious case study to sort of reveal this mongrelizing of the debate, which is constantly turns it into, if you're pro-animal, therefore you must be anti-human, because animals, if you care for animals, then you obviously don't care about humans, and you don't care that they don't get to eat and all that kind of stuff, and they don't get to earn their money, and all their industries will sort of collapse as a result. It was so black and white in Australia. It was so either for or against, and there was no sort of subtlety, or there was no nuance to the debates. You know, and there were lots of stereotypes going around about what it would be to be an Indonesian and what it would be to be poor, and a lot of those stereotypes were like sort of like 40-hour famine ads, like the Indonesians are starving. If they don't get their cows, they're going to starve to death. I mean, the Indonesians aren't starving.
And it's not the poor people that are eating beef.
And anyway, it's the top 10% who are buying beef, and admittedly that's a great industry because it's 23 million people, it's more than the entire of Australia. But they are particularly not starving. They're eating beef because it's a status symbol. It's an idea of, it's a Western diet that has been introduced to them. And I found that really interesting because there was a lot of debate about us foisting our ideas about animal welfare and our ideas about good management and good industry onto a country that we're constantly telling them what to do. But there was no one was saying that we weren't already doing that. Like Meat and Livestock Australia had been running campaigns about how beef is good for them and better for them and will make them smarter and stronger, and if you love your kids, you'll feed them beef. They've been running those campaigns for years in Indonesia. Isn't that foisting our ideas onto them already? So I just didn't, I went to Indonesia because there was so much complexity and it just didn't seem to be coming through in that current debate. You know, there was also some footage released from a Gippsland abattoir, and it didn't have anywhere near as much retaliation or horror as, you know, the Indonesian footage did have. So, you know, why were we much more able to say what Indonesia was doing wrong as opposed to what we're doing to our own livestock? And I think we all felt quite comfortable by sort of retreating to the position that, well, we stun, so therefore it's okay. We stun our animals, so therefore they're killed humanely, and therefore what we do is okay in comparison to Indonesia. But as the quote that you mentioned earlier, the Coetzee quote, is that, I mean, is that okay? Is it okay that we line up millions of animals every day and stun them and breed them, and they have absolutely no animalistic life apart from serving our purposes? Is that really okay? So that's what I was exploring.
And you went to Indonesia to do your own research.
Yeah.
Did you see some of the sorts of things that were in the videos on Four Corners yourself?
Yeah, I did. But I think the Four Corners program, that actual program, was incredible, and it was absolutely necessary. But I think that's the difference between me and a Four Corners program, is that they are very focused in what they want to show and the story they want to produce. Whereas I'm very interested in what's inside the frame, but I'm also really interested in what's outside the frame. So I was watching some slaughters, but I could also see the outside scenario, which was workers who were not much older than boys, trying to handle huge animals, and not knowing what to do. And you know, I don't really think that we would understand what it would mean to break your arm in Indonesia. I mean, these guys could easily have broken their arm in Indonesia, you know, trying to grapple with these animals. And, you know, hospital isn't just over there. There isn't any Medicare. So I imagine that there's a very different approach to protecting yourself around these animals.
Can I ask you, in Indonesia, did you get a sense of a difference in the way people think about their relationships with animal and livestock?
I mean, I think I write this in the essay that I may have been a little bit desperate to see some good human-animal relationships in Indonesia, so I may have just been latching onto things. But, you know, there was one really kind of quite beautiful moment that you would never see here, mainly because of health regulations. But, you know, watching a butcher in Indonesia sort of carve up a cow and this little scruffy kitten hanging around him and him stepping over it without thinking about it and never stepping on it and never shooing it away. And I just sort of looked at this kid and thought, it has so much more agency than a cat in Australia, in the sense of, imagine the hoo-ha that would cause in Australia, a cat and the butcher, and, you know, what about the customers and what about the health, and This cat and this butcher were allowed to live alongside one another. And that's not to say that he cared for it, but he didn't not care for it. He just let it exist. And I just found that to be a really interesting sort of difference in their society to our society. And there really weren't many good observations to make in Indonesia. As in Southeast Asia, there are, you know, I wouldn't want to be an animal in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, it was a really good comparison to our own ridiculousness over animals, our constant fawning over cats and dogs, and, you know, they need to be in their place and they don't have any agency. They could never just walk around the block on their own. That would just be ridiculous. So there was something quite beautiful about that very tiny moment.
Did you come to any conclusions about how live cattle trading should proceed? Because you do make the point that it's very difficult to just say, well, look, we won't trade to Indonesia at all because they'll simply get cows from elsewhere.
Yeah, it's really difficult just to ban it. I mean, it's one of those situations where I wish we'd never gotten into in the first place, because unfortunately we've now created a demand for beef, and if we don't satisfy that demand, Indonesia is not simply going to go, oh, well, we'll stop eating this much beef. They're going to find the beef another way. So then you're looking at situations that might involve beef coming from countries such as India and Brazil, which could create, you know, more and more exotic diseases being introduced into our region. Or you have Indonesia potentially just clearing even more rainforest than what's going on right now, and, you know, crucial orangutan habitat, and creating their own herds. So we're kind of in a really crap situation. Just to get out doesn't actually really fix the problem. But then again, we're relying on agencies in an industry that hasn't got a very good track record of actually responding to animal welfare. So,
well, it's interesting. I think part of what you drew attention to is also the kind of hypocrisy of the situation where we're confronted with vision from inside an abattoir, and you're really confronted with animals losing their rights. And because we don't see footage from inside Australian abattoirs because they more or less all ban it, we're confronted with animals with no rights, at which point we say, this is an outrage.
Yeah, yeah.
But you make a point that that different animals have different rights around the world. What about in Australia? How is legislation for different sorts of animals in Australia?
Yeah, well, animal welfare, companion animals, pets have a hell of a lot more rights than livestock. Livestock don't necessarily have to have access to natural sunlight or even access to a space greater than their body. So livestock is that's the bottom of all the places. If you're going to be an animal, you don't want to be livestock. You want to be a dog or a cat. There's no consistency to what we're allowed to do with them or not to them. So
there's a large section in your essay also on animal testing, just to move on animal testing in Australia, which is much more widespread than people think or realise. Can you give us a sketch of the main practices of animal testing and where the sort of main numbers of animal testing occur?
A lot of people, when they think of animal testing, they think it must be to do with medicine. And that's not true at all. I don't know the exact percentage of what animals are used for medical testing, but a lot of them are used in agricultural testing, which is usually how to create a better meat to bone ratio, how to produce a more efficient chicken, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of testing done there. There's testing done in chemicals, and there's also a toxicology test, which is being phased out now, but it was called a lethal test, which was to show just how much of a certain substance would kill an animal and how long it would take. So animals were literally lined up just to be killed by a poison. And that was really common, and a lot of things wouldn't go on the market without that test. So, and then there's also makeup and all of that kind of stuff, which people think is finished, but it has in Australia, but doesn't mean our products that we buy don't continue this elsewhere.
Is there any way of tracking the numbers or the number of locations where animal testing occurs?
No, it's really secret. It's really secretive. So it's around about 6 million animals are used in Australia, and there's no national database. There's only state ones, and that's usually just for institutions that are quite established that actually, relay their numbers to that database. Plus they have institutions such as universities will have ethical committees. But as I write about in the essay, that their ethics may actually seem a little bit out of sync with what, say, your average person on the streets, their ethics might be. So their ethics are very human focused as opposed to more of a balance.
Did you come across instances of animal testing that you were absolutely fine with and thought, I don't have any qualms about this, or did you always find it a bit problematic personally?
This was really difficult to write because this, and I think this is our version of Indonesia. I think this is Australia's version of Indonesia. This is our allowance. This is how we would start to get a little bit nervous and say, oh, actually, well, maybe it's okay, because everything we ingest in terms of pharmaceuticals is due to an animal. And they're not on the labels because it's not the ingredients, it's actually, there should be ingredients and there should be method. And in the method, they should have how many animals were used. And maybe then we might consider just how many illnesses we want to each have. We might actually stop being quite so hypochondriac about our health if we actually saw how many animals went into each pharmaceutical that we take. But
you wouldn't advocate like a blanket ban on animal testing for, for example, you do raise the testing of pigs for organ transplant reasons. That seems like a pretty defensible sort of method of animal testing, doesn't it?
No.
No?
No.
Tell me why.
Because that's our donation is at the utmost. Our human organ donation, we are the lowest and one of the lowest countries in the world, first world developed countries that donate our organs, and we could actually satisfy that demand. It doesn't need to be other animals actually compensating for our selfishness, our inability to tick the right box when we get our license. Where is the organ donorship campaign? Why isn't there ads on TV saying you should donate your organs? Why are pigs just stepping in and doing it for us? I mean, that is actually one of the most obvious no's.
What about the testing for the rejection of organs?
Yeah, I don't know. It's really confusing. I
think it's really interesting and great that you've written about it, because it's something that is almost impossible to debate while we don't know what's being done in our name.
Exactly. And I think that's the thing that's really important. And these secret locations, and I understand why they're secret, because people say that animal radical groups will come and trash them and set the baboons free. But everyone I've spoken to who hasn't been insiders to this world are amazed to hear that we have macaque, marmoset, baboon colonies in Australia specifically bred for testing. And that we don't know about that, and that we don't know that this is done in our name, to me says that something hasn't been discussed. And I can't advocate for a blanket ban, but I certainly advocate for transparency.
In your essay's final section, you address our relationship with animals in the wild through the prism of population control and culling. What are the different ways that in Australia that we try to control animal populations?
We use a lot of poison baits, 1080, which is for foxes and for dingoes. At the moment, Victoria, as a result of the Premier's incoming election, he promised to introduce a bounty, which involves hunters bringing in fox mask. That the hunters call it mask because they just sort of peel off the face of a fox and deliver those, and they get $10. Or a dingo backstrap, which is the dingo's face, ears, back and tail, and they get $50. So apparently that is population control, but most scientists I spoke to think it's just a very popular shoe-in for the rural vote, but it doesn't really do much for population numbers.
It seemed like a really imprecise control mechanism because, as I understand it, it's very difficult to tell the difference between wild dogs, dingoes, and there's not really any sense of what the true numbers are anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, dingoes in Victoria have this ironic status again of being a protected species and vermin at the same time. So it depends where they are, really. Depends if they cross over an invisible line, they become vermin. Which, I mean, you know, if you're a dingo, that line is not something that's in your genetic makeup. You're a dingo. That's what you do. You wander. You don't have a line that says, oh, now I've become vermin, I should get back to being protected species over here. And yeah, as a result for the wild dog cull, a lot of dingoes, whether they're pure dingoes or hybrid dingoes, a lot of them have turned up in the culls. So,
do you think the regulation or the way that decisions are made vis-a-vis dingoes, it seems like it's kind of the latest in a long line of Australian versions of trying to control fauna populations?
Yeah.
We don't seem to be very good at it, huh?
Yeah, we don't understand complexity or the idea of what happens when we remove certain creatures from an ecosystem. Are we creating a situation where different creatures, potentially more destructive creatures, can come in because we've taken out predators? So
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, what you write about in terms of the predators at the top of the food chain. Tell us what happens if you remove the likes of dingoes.
And it's really fascinating. America's really starting to understand the ramifications of it, and so is Europe. Is if you remove an apex predator, is that you create a trophic cascade, which is like basically again like a domino effect, and the rest of the ecology and the environment sort of collapses as a result of that loss. And the predator is not just something that hunts and kills, it is also something that has a very important presence. So without an apex predator, herbivores go crazy and usually end up demolishing the environment. So we're creating a great land for rabbits again, which is kind of ironic. And wherever the dingoes have been culled, foxes become really prominent and move in, as do feral cats.
And become more dangerous than the original predators that were removed.
They've got no one to worry about. They've got no dingo territory to be concerned about. And they may as well just, bask in the open and, have cocktails and think about how great Australia is, because they don't have a predator. So, and in Tasmania, this is even more dangerous at the moment because they're losing the Tasmanian devil. And feral cats down there really haven't had a huge effect on the environment down there. But studies are beginning to show that the environment and feral cats are beginning to really clash at the moment because the devils have been dying off. So it's particularly obvious in Tasmania.
Is it partly a function of the way that land is allocated, over-allocated now compared to, say, 50 years ago? There were much more national parks or less people, less roads, etc. Are these problems just tied up with the increasing control of humans over their environment, or do you think it's just bad information and regulation?
Even the idea of a national park is a little bit ridiculous because you're bottlenecking everything into one particular space, and then you're telling everything in that space that it's not allowed to leave, which doesn't make sense to the natural order of the movement of animals. So this our constant desire to control spaces and to draw lines around them don't really correspond with how nature works. And I guess it's our inability to share. Whenever an animal population blossoms, we immediately call it a plague population or vermin. We just can't comprehend, that we need to share the space. It's just not in our mindset for some reason.
I think you've written a great essay, so thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Nick.